I'm Laura O'Dwyer. I'm a professor in the Measurement, Evaluation, Statistics and Assessment at Boston College. I work in a variety of things because I'm a measurement and quantitative person, quantitative methodologist. So work in a variety of things, and this is one of them.
Hello, I'm Cynthia Furman. I'm Associate Professor at UMass Chan Medical School. I direct Professional Development Hub and am co-PI on this project.
Hi, I'm Corey Kanyoshi. It's great to see all of you. Some of you I haven't seen for a couple of years in person, so it's great to see your faces. I am Corey Kanyoshi. I work at the American Chemical Society, and I'm really enthusiastic about this project. I'm the PI on this project, and it's been a really interesting and amazing journey. And one thing, I've been involved with professional development for graduate students for about 16 years at ACS, and also with the development of the CAM IDP platform that came out in 2015. And so being able to conduct this type of study and research is very pivotal for what we're trying to accomplish with students. So it's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll hand it over to our speakers now.
So Cynthia is going to be our slide advancer, among many other things today. And thank you, Katie and Amy. So our talk today is on the role of measurement in evaluation and research, a case study of the toolkit for assessing the IDP process. So one of our team members that is not here today is one of the co-PIs, which is Georg Schlatterer. So in our agenda today, I'm going to give a brief introduction of the NSF impact instruments and indicators for IDPs. We, throughout this seminar, will refer to it as I3IDP project. Then Laura and Cynthia are going to talk about the role of measurement in career and professional development, provide a framework for what we're trying to accomplish. We're going to talk about how the I3IDP project developed its measurements, and then how can the I3IDP toolkit have an impact on students and institutions. Then we're going to end with a few concluding thoughts, and we'd love to hear your questions. So just a brief history leading up to our study. I won't go through all of the different timeline events, but we wanted to propose the history leading up to what has happened with the IDP study and why we're at the point where we wanted to develop a toolkit and to determine what we can do with that toolkit. So there was the FACET proposes IDP framework that really started a lot of this IDP discussion. It was there to promote a framework to help postdocs pursue career goals. A number of things happened, and framework reports, platforms were developed, training and innovations were suggested, policy papers happened, and of course, two platforms that were created were CAM IDP and GCC launched the Imagine PhD platform. All of these things really were responding to different needs within the professional development community focused on graduate education. And because of this, there was a real desire to understand how IDPs work for graduate students. Now, individual development plans in graduate education were sporadically used in training. Funders like NIH asked for systematic and equitable career and professional development support of graduate students. Along with that, there was a lack of consistent use of IDPs and definitions around IDP processes and IDPs. Many institutions had their own definitions and own PDF ideas of what IDPs are and were and how they worked and what they were used for. There was also a lack of framework that supports the evolution of local organizational IDP processes. Along with that, there's a lack of rigorous evidence base of IDP process effectiveness. So one study that was mentioned in the timeline that came out in 2005 was the Sigma Psi survey. This showed that postdocs, when compared to their peers, when they had written plans, they were more likely to submit papers to peer-reviewed journals. They were more likely to publish first author papers and more likely to submit grant proposals at a higher rate. They were shown to be 25 less likely to report that their advisors did not meet their initial expectations. So this is one of the studies that was meant to collect evidence of if IDPs could be effective. But that's, even with the 2005 studies, we still are left with a number of questions. Some of those key questions are, what is the scope of the IDP process for graduate students? How do we define success in the IDP process? Is success quantifiable? If so, how do we measure it? And how do we demonstrate the efficacy of different implementations of the IDP process? And this leads us to what the project goals and objectives are for I3IDP. They are to build a foundation for determining how and why the IDP process is effective for STEM graduate students. That included defining the IDP and the core components of the process in the context of the rich wealth of literature that exists in social sciences and considering theoretical frameworks that exist. Define anticipated measurable outcomes for the IDP process. Develop and test a set of instruments for demonstrating change in student actions and attitudes resulting from the use of the IDP process, and recommend strategies for using the I3IDP to study impacts of educational interventions, the workshops that we do, the programming that we have for graduate students, which is all intended to support their career journey. And with that, I will turn it over to Laura.
Thank you, Corey. So when we are conducting research, and I don't mean an individual study, but in general, conducting research to understand a new area, a new topic, we have this sort of pyramid shape setup, if you think about it. You know, it starts with anecdotal evidence, expert opinion, practitioner wisdom, and then out of that come qualitative and quantitative case studies, and then cohort studies, and then meta-analyses, and then systematic review. And the idea being that no single study is going to change the field. We have to have many, many studies that will do that. And one really important part of that is having data. So conducting quantitative and qualitative case studies. And this is where, along the continuum of having a full and rich body of research about the impact of IDPs, this is where we think our piece of work here fits in. It will allow us to generate data that will inform future studies, and also, more importantly actually, generate instruments that have empirical backup for their use. Next slide, please. Okay. So in order to do any research on the effectiveness of anything, including IDPs, quality data are needed. So if we think about these questions, these three questions, do students who engage in the IDP process have greater self-awareness than students who do not engage in the IDP process? Does a particular IDP model lead students to engage in career exploration activities earlier in their studies? Do students who are encouraged to complete an IDP feel better prepared to make a career decision than students who were not encouraged to complete an IDP? So these might be the types of questions that an individual or professional might want to ask. So in order to be able to answer these questions, you would need to collect data. But before you collect any data, you would need to take measures. So measurement of behaviors, actions, beliefs, attitudes. So thinking about the questions before, how is self-awareness defined? There are lots of different definitions out there, but how are you defining it? And what does it look like? How does it manifest in students' behaviors, actions, beliefs, etc.? So if we think about self-awareness as a construct, so if you're not familiar with the term construct, it's some observable, unobservable characteristic. So a construct could be your knowledge of 8th grade algebra concepts. It could be anxiety, it could be self-awareness, it could be all sorts of things. So in this case, the construct is self-awareness. And we would want to think about, well, what does it look like? If somebody was high on the self-awareness construct, what would that look like compared to somebody who was low on the self-awareness construct? For the second question, you might think, well, what kinds of career explorations do students engage in? And when do they engage in those activities? You would have to think about your definition of being prepared to make a career decision. And then you would have to think about, well, what would that look like if somebody was well prepared to make a career decision versus unprepared to make a career decision? So this is all part of the process of thinking about ways to measure so that you can collect data to answer the research questions that you're interested in. Next slide, please, Cynthia. So that a measurement, a tool, an instrument can generate data that is useful, the data must be valid and reliable. I often hear people say, well, this has been validated. Well, there's no such thing really as a validated instrument or a tool. We may have provided, or we may provide evidence of the validity of our tool for particular purposes. But if you were going to use these tools to make inferences about how well somebody can drive a car, that's not valid. So validity is about the use of the instrument, the use of the data generated by the instrument. So it has to be used for the purposes for which it was intended. And then reliability has to do with the consistency of the data collected, right? Is it stable over time? We can have reliability without validity, as in you can consistently measure something that is not useful. But in order for something to be valid, to provide valid data, it must also be consistent. So these are some of the measurement terms that we think of when we begin to develop our instrumentation. So these are sort of the steps in general, which we actually followed in developing a measure. So we would define your construct. So let's say self-awareness is our construct. What do you mean by self-awareness? There are lots of various definitions out there. So you would have to come up with a definition of self-awareness that is grounded in past research, that makes sense for your context, etc. The next question would be what would that look like, right? What would self-awareness, high levels of self-awareness look like compared to low levels of self-awareness? The next step in generating an instrument, a measure, is to generate a pool of survey questions. So I call them items here. And then you have it reviewed by experts. And this is part of what we call content validity, because validity isn't just a single concept. There are various dimensions of validity that we must consider. Then you would field test the measure, conduct cognitive interviews, focus groups, etc. Next slide. Make revisions as needed and repeat the expert review and field testing steps. Then you would finalize the format and administer the instrument to a pilot sample. Your next step, and that's what we'll be showing today, is to conduct analyses to explore how the survey questions, the items, and the groups of survey items, which we call scales, are behaving in the sample. And if necessary, you would repeat all steps. You may find at the end of this year-long process, you have made some mistakes in your definitions and you need to revisit everything. So this is an iterative process. Next step, Cynthia. So I think this.
Mute myself. So I'm going to kind of now take what Laura just introduced as the typical process for this and show you how we've applied it in the I3 IDP project. So first, she talked about, you need to really understand what you're measuring. And so something that we realized in our cross-collaborative team, which included, chemists, biomedical scientists, right? Like I'd worked a lot on my IDP, Corey had developed a chem IDP, and we hadn't worked together a ton before this project, which was really valuable because it instantly, even within our team, you recognized that there were some variations in how words we used to describe IDPs. We also brought a lot of experience and had held multiple focus groups with many of you all, education researchers, other people who are connected or work on IDPs in various ways. And what we found is that there's lots of definitions of IDPs, and there's lots of ways that people kind of use the term, but there wasn't a solid definition. So we started with defining that the IDP itself it's the documentation of one's engagement in the IDP process. But it's really the IDP process that we want to study and look at, because our intervention should really be about guiding students through this process. So the IDP process is a set of activities that one engages in to create this informed plan for their professional development. And it's iterative, and it involves multiple core components that each occur iteratively. And then it's related to one's identity formation, something that we recognize as we drew upon the literature in developing these definitions. So we have this visual that represents the 4 core components for the IDP process. And I'm not going to go into the detail about this because we've talked about this in other talks through GCC. But the 4 components are self-assessment. So basically, understanding more about yourself, building your own self-awareness. Exploration, maybe correct exploration of career options, exploration of professional development options. Goal setting, which is really like, how are you going to get there? So what goals will you set to advance your towards your career development goals, and what goals might you be setting around other professional development needs? And along the way, you'll also be making lots of decisions. So decisions about career interest in the future and other decisions on prioritization that happens through this iterative process. And again, a key thing to really think about, which we drew out of the literature and recognized, is that all of this is related deeply to identity formation. So what we did is we took these 4 core components: self-assessment, career exploration, goal setting, and decision-making. And we've leveraged those. We recognize that those would work well. Those are really the core outcomes that we want to measure with these instruments. So taking those as our outcomes, we then defined indicators. So what are things that would indicate that one has reached outcomes related to career exploration, right? So there's all kinds of indicators, things related to changes in attitudes, behaviors, etc. We define those for each of those 4 core components or outcomes. And then Laura did a lot of work based on our discussions, and we did a lot of iterative work and editing together on these and drafting a whole ton of survey questions. And these survey questions were designed to understand and do measurement around the indicators. So when she uses the term items, or we use the term items, what we're really referring to are questions in a survey, and the survey being the instrument. So what one does next, as she described, is the items actually go together to form scales. And so one thing that we do next is group the items into scales. And the scales, a scale is a group of items that measures the same construct, as she pointed out. And so what we end up having is a set of scales for each one of these outcomes, which happen to be our core components of the IDP process. So when you're actually doing measurement, you're really measuring through these scales. So we've done a lot of work in the past year in testing, looking at these items, field testing them and pilot testing them, which I'll show you in a moment. And Laura will show you how we then hypothesize what the scales are, how they group together in scales, and test that hypothesis. So just walking through these steps that she's introduced to you, we started by defining the outcomes. Again, we used the core components for the IDP process, which we defined, defining the indicators for those, and then drafting items. And some of those items, we actually, did dive into the literature and adapted scales that had already been published for our own population and needs here. We then did field testing. And so what field testing is we invited students to form focus groups with us from our campus at UMass Chan Medical School. And each small focus group of students read through in real time in the focus group sets of survey questions and discussed them and talked them through and shared anything that they found confusing. And Laura asked them questions about the items. And this was to test to make sure that they were understanding the items as they were intended to be understood. In step 5, we moved to pilot testing the items. And so what we do here is we partnered with many of you. So thank you so much for volunteering as partners through this. We had a number of institutions that we partnered with to invite graduate students to participate in this pilot test. So we had students across many different STEM fields. And actually what happened is we got a total of approximately 300 responses. But it's kind of interesting because they're kind of overlapping data sets. The survey, if we gave every student who is pilot testing the full survey, it would be ginormous. And so we gave them kind of overlapping sets of items, leading to 100 or so responses for each item through the pilot test. So in one sample of these students, for example, was 112 students, 70% of them were female, 60% of them were 27 years or younger. A number of them were married, had dependents. We had a mix of ethnicities and races. We had samplings across different years in graduate training, and 87% of them were permanent residents or citizens, and the remainder were on visas or other status. So we really aim to have a wide diversity of students. And this is important because the pilot testing is a really important part of this process.
Thank you, Cynthia. I want to
describe to you now once we collected all this data from the students, she's going to share with you this really interesting process that she led us through in terms of grouping the items together.
Right. Thank you, Cynthia. One thing that you might be curious about is why? Why do we need groups of items to measure a particular construct? Well, if you consider anxiety, everybody has anxiety at various points. Even if they don't consider themselves an anxious person, if you were to ask a person just a simple question, are you anxious? Then they may feel that it's a socially desirable response to say that they're not, right? Or they might not have a sense that they are actually anxious. So what we tend to do is ask multiple questions that are getting at a similar sort of getting at the underlying construct. So for example, instead of saying, are you anxious? I might say, when you're asked to perform, does your heart race? Do the palms of your hands perspire? Okay. So what we're doing is we're not actually asking directly, we're asking through groups of items that if the person responds in a particular way to this set of items, we can infer from their responses that they have anxiety or something else. So once we had collected our data, our pilot data, I should say, our next step was to conduct analyses to explore how the individual questions were behaving and also how the groups of items were behaving. Well, so what did we want to see? Well, we want to see responses that scan the entire scale. You don't want survey questions so extreme that everybody disagrees with them or agrees with them. You want to see a distribution among the responses, but you want the average to be around the center of the scale. Then what we want are the items when we conduct specific dimension reduction analyses. We want to see that the items cluster together according to how we hypothesized they would behave. And we want the reliability estimate to be greater than or equal to 0.7. Now, a reliability estimate is a it goes from 0 to 1. And in this case, if it's 0.7, that's indicating that 70% of the variability in the responses is due to real variability and not just noise. Cynthia, can I get the next slide? So here's an example. Of course, I'm showing you one that worked right off the bat. So we hypothesized that these 5 items would be measuring the same thing. Right now, we had a hypothesis as to what that thing was. Right? So our goal was to look at the responses, everybody's responses to these 5 items, and reduce the number of dimensions in the responses by looking at the inter-item covariances and correlations using techniques called factor analysis to see what dimensions emerged. So I'll show you the next slide. Okay. So what you're seeing on the left with this table is these are called factor loadings. These numbers in the table, you know, the 0.865, et cetera, are basically the correlation between the responses to this item and the latent construct, right? The thing that we cannot see. So what we're seeing here is that these are all positively correlated with this latent construct, this hidden construct that we can't see. We're getting a single dimension in the data. The factor loadings are all above 0.5. The reliability is 0.7. Right? And this is a good solution. Now, running or conducting factor analyses and interpreting them is both a science and an art. The science comes in looking at the numbers like this, and then the art comes in the naming. Like I could take these 5 questions and say, this is a measure of somebody's self-confidence, but that wouldn't be the right name for this. So what we named it was importance of intrinsic self-knowledge. Right? Individuals who are high on this believe that it's important to know themselves. People who are low on these 5 items combined do not think it's important. Here's another example. So we had 5 different questions, 5 other questions, which we hypothesized were measuring another construct. What you saw in the previous slide was a table that just had 1 column, factor 1. Here I'm getting 2 factors. I'm getting 2 different dimensions in the data. And what we're seeing here, if you look over on the x-axis, you've got 3 items that are grouping together. And then on the y-axis, you see 2 items that are grouping together, but it's not necessarily a clean solution, right? When we saw something like this, we were like, this is not representing a unidimensional construct that is useful to us to name. So we didn't even name this. We didn't even look at the reliability of it. And we went back to the drawing board. Now, those 2 examples, if you can imagine repeating those thousands of times, that's where we were, right? In finding the best psychometrically sound scale to represent the constructs that essentially are under the indicators and under our components, our 4 components. Cynthia, you're up.
This is for Corey.
Thank you. So one of the things that has been really interesting on this project is just kind of the merging of thinking about how the theoretical framework, which I'm showing you here, is connected to current research, which is connected to the research that we would like to gather, which is connected to programming that we could do for and plan for graduate students, and thinking about how to facilitate self-assessment, career exploration, goal setting, and decision-making, and considering the wide swath of graduate students that exist, including international students and underrepresented groups within STEM, as well as gender differences and other types of identity differences. And this is one of the reasons why it was very pivotal and important for us to understand the connection with identity formation. So I'm going to give you just like an example of one perspective of from myself that works with graduate student professional development and is very interested in delving into the research. So here is a representation of the scale of self-assessment, decision-making, career exploration, and goal setting as it could be represented in a toolkit, where you see the different sheets could be indicators and scales like the ones that Laura and Cynthia went over. Next slide. So in the work that I do, I work with undergraduates and graduate students, and there is a lot of focus on providing them relational support in career development, which happens to be one of the scales that we have within self-assessment in the I3IDP toolkit. One of the things that relational support in career development is really looking at is the mentor-mentee relationship and the type of support that the mentee feels in their career development. Next slide. Another thing that I am deeply interested in, based on working with graduate students and postdocs in professional development, is knowing do they know where career information can be found? So that is another scale. This particular scale is under career exploration. Okay, so one of the things is we took off the titles of these particular graphs because we didn't want to make the situation really murky. But what I'm showing you here is a representation of one of the scales that we were looking at when we looked at cohort responses based on underrepresented groups. So this is looking at the responses of one of the scales in terms of ethnic and race differences. And so one of the things that you can see here is that within the sample size, and of course, the more data that you're able to gather, the better results you're going to be able to use. From this, you could see there are observable differences, even in our small pilot test sample. There's observable differences between the groups that can kind of show you the differences of the IDP process, whether it's relational support or whether it's looking at whether they know where career information can be found, whether that's at your university or external to the university, or even the type of support that they have from like their family experiences or other network sources. So one of the things that this slide, can you advance the next slide, Cynthia? I think there's one. So just to give you an example then of the bigger picture, we have the theoretical framework that has all these 4 components that Cynthia talked about. When you look at something like goal setting as a component individually, you can think about the interventions that exist for goal setting. That includes, as many of you know, how to make SMART goals. A lot of us have different workshops associated with making SMART goals. How to align your goals with self. How to do that considering your particular strengths and values. I'm saying your, but what I'm talking about is how to help the student align with their particular values and their strengths. Mapping out a career plan and tracking progress. Teaching the students how to promote their brand. These are typical really impactful types of interventions that are well known in goal setting that many of you are aware with. Along with that, in the red category, we've been putting together a list of potential barriers. Many of these are in the context of, and could be in the context of coming from different underrepresented groups, and how in graduate school you could get treated differently based on your unique identities. So there's potential barriers shown in the literature that are really attributed to setting goals. These include having a fixed mindset about abilities, making less challenging goals, lack of prioritization of goals, imposter syndrome, resistance to change, goals, making goals that are inherently not strategic, measurable, actionable, realistic, or timely, or lack, a really big one, lack of mentors to facilitate. So keeping in mind the interventions that you know exist and have used, along with the potential barriers and what we know from literature and research, we can couple those things along with the framework, with the I3 IDP toolkit and visualization, and think about interventions that can be customized to the needs of particular groups. Or if you would rather, the aggregate of your student population, the student body that you serve. I used an example that I'm interested in, my own program, which is really, can you go back to the next slide, Cynthia? Thank you. Which is really an example of that intervention for us would be establishing a mentor-mentee program, which is specifically based on the mentor helping walk through and work through the career goals, targeting a cohort or a group that has indicated they're having difficulty with the IDP process. And one thing that we wanted to point out is that we really want to consider the benefit of using tools like the I3 IDP measurements with cohorts over time, not just one sitting and not just with one student, because it's really meant to be used with an aggregate number of students in order to be effective. Advance one more slide. Thank you. And then just, this is the same example. Yeah, sorry, I think I accidentally put in animation that didn't belong there. So this is just the same kind of example, but instead of goal setting, looking at career exploration, considering the interventions that exist within the framework of the IDP process, considering the potential barriers that are noted in literature and research that has already been done. There's extensive amount of research that has been done in career exploration, a lot of it in vocational psychology, and then pairing that with what you can find with the I3 IDP toolkit, along with visualizations. One of the examples that I brought up earlier had to do with whether students knew about access to career information or different career opportunities. And an intervention, potential intervention that we would like to bring, for example, is to have career panels and career resource sessions targeting cohorts in that particular way. So there's a number of possible ways that this can be used. Next slide. So just to kind of wrap up what we were talking about, this project has been a really incredible journey. The idea has been that we take the theoretical construct in framework, understanding the definition of the IDP process, having clarity around those definitions, and using that theoretical framework to attach to the rich resources of literature that exists, couple it to the toolkit, the research that is done on the toolkit, the data visualizations that are possible, looking at different groups, and also creating from these interventions that support diverse identities. All of this in context of going through the IDP process. Next slide. So that concludes our talk. We did want to particularly give a big thank you to all the institutions, universities, and our colleagues that made this possible, as well as all of our colleagues on the team, Cynthia, Laura, Jorg, Leslie, Robert. We could not have done any of the study without the partnership with these universities listed. And so we're very grateful for that. And we look forward to continued partnerships. Next slide. For our next step with the I3 IDP, we're at the final stage of the analysis for testing. We have a manuscript that is in progress that really looks at the theoretical framework and makes the identity formation connection. And then we also have a manuscript in progress that is really more focused on the IDP toolkit itself, and as well as institutional use cases. We will update the website regularly. And thank you very much. We look forward to your questions.
So we have a number of questions coming into the chat window. Laura, I thought we could start with a question. I direct chatted it to you. I'll read the question. The question is, given the sample in the pilot is a low percentage for international students, and given that so many STEM doctoral students are international, will there be further examination of the use of the instruments with international students?
Yes, that is a great question. It so happens that the sample that Cynthia showed you lacked diversity in terms of international students. We haven't looked closely yet at whether that's the same for the other samples. Again, there are 4 samples, I believe. So, but yes, validity, for something to be valid, it must also be valid with a particular group. We paid a lot of attention when we were writing our survey items to think about, well, what might the obstacles be for an international student versus a student who is born and raised in the United States? Okay, so we certainly will look at whether we have sort of measurement invariance. Basically, does the measure act the same way across different student groups? They could be higher or lower naturally, but the instrument should behave in the same way. So yes, short answer is yes, we will be doing more work on that front.
That's great. And it looks like there's a comment here in the chat window as well saying that Tanya Katswada shared that she's learned from publications that international students are less likely to participate in the IDP process. So again, a good reason to look at different populations within our samples and make sure there's good sampling there.
Yes, I would agree with that. There are many different types of pressures, and spending time on self-assessment and self-awareness might not be somebody's high priority if they are here for a particular purpose in the US for a particular purpose, which is to get a degree. Okay.
Yes. So there's also a question here, maybe Corey, I don't know if you want to take this one. Susan Martin's asking, what level of receptivity is there currently among faculty for engaging in the IDP process? And is there research about this?
So I'll take a stab, and then I'd love to hear what you think, Cynthia and Laura. So from the audiences that I've been involved with, especially with faculty, if you say something like IDP process, it doesn't go very hit very directly. Something that does is more about career and training plan and goal setting. Those are the things that are more connected and more probably because they are assumed to be more tangible, even though, as you know, they're all connected to the IDP process. To Laura's point, what she said about self-awareness, it's we've found that it's all a part of the messaging and the packaging, how well people will receive something like that. If we tell them there's a self-awareness workshop, they're not likely to sign up. If it is about really utilizing your strengths to target a resume, even though, building your resume and being able to create your personal brand, even though inherently what we're doing is taking them through a good portion of the IDP process to do it, yes, it's clearly very much about the messaging that we use.
So I'll just briefly add before going on to another question is that, like we're not studying these things right now in this process. We're using the pilot data to, do these factor analyses and test our hypotheses for how items pull together into scales, right? So building our constructs. But that's why this toolkit will be so valuable, is to study a lot more of these things, right? And some of the interventions might be interventions with faculty. And I will share that I do think one really great byproduct of this project could be people really thinking about the process underlying creating an IDP. And that can include faculty really thinking about that, right? So there's these 4 components. Are we just asking our students to write down goals, or are we having them go through a process where they're reflecting and taking time to build a self-awareness and to take stock of where they're at and to really think about barriers and challenges they're facing and do some exploration? So are we really guiding them through the IDP process, or are we simply having them write down goals or some other one-step part of the process? So that's one aspect of this that I'm hoping will be a benefit. There's a question here about asking whether our sample was exclusively graduate students and whether we plan on studying postdocs. Corey, do you want to address that briefly?
I think that I'm going to hit that question over to Laura. Mm-hmm. I can say that this was our sample that we have tested was exclusively with graduate students.
Right. Yeah, just to follow up on both what Cynthia and Corey just said, we were not trying to understand the patterns of behaviors in students, graduate students across the country when we were doing this. Our goal was to develop instruments. And when you develop instruments, you're not concerned about whether this sample is representative of some population. What you would like to see is that it has individuals who vary on the constructs. It would be like if you're developing a meter stick, as though there weren't one already available, right? You would want people who were short and people who were tall so that you could calibrate your meter stick properly. But you don't need a representative sample from the population in order to be able to say, this meter stick is measuring height, right? So as Cynthia said, future studies will look more at this. Of course, there are other psychometric things that need to be done. So do the measures behave the same way for postdocs? Do they behave the same way for international students, right? But then the substantive questions are, how do postdocs respond differently from grad students, or how do international students respond differently from native students?
Right, so our goal is to put out this toolkit and empower the community to help all of us working together to help pull together, data to ask various questions using this toolkit to measure things and answer these questions. What questions am I missing here?
Yeah, the question about self-selection is another good one. Again, that would be something that would be looked at in a post-development phase, meaning that once the instruments have been psychometrically examined, that would be a research question that somebody could answer using this toolkit.
I'm just scanning the questions to see if there's additional ones. Oh, right, thank you. There was a question about whether this toolkit could be used with non-STEM students. Laura, do you want to reflect about that? Students, you know, for example, doctoral students in the social sciences or humanities or the arts.
So I am technically not in the hard sciences, but I do work with social scientists, and most of our students are going to be quantitative methodologists. The things that have come up here, the things that we have talked about, are all relevant for non-STEM areas as well, as far as I can see. There may be additional things that need to be considered. So for example, you might, in my field, you would actually say, have you considered industry? Because many of our students go into industry. But maybe if they were studying, I don't know, curriculum and instruction or social work, one wouldn't ask, do you plan to go into industry? So I can imagine there might be some additional questions that would be added, but I don't see that this is not useful. I think it's highly useful.
And what about the testing that we've done? I mean, all the pilot testing and focus, you know, field testing has all been done with STEM students. Can you remark on that, kind of the awareness that the testing has been done with STEM students, but not with humanities or arts or social sciences students?
I think only some of the questions would have to be looked at again. So for example, if you were to go back to that slide with the 5 questions on it about importance of intrinsic self-knowledge, there's nothing there that is specifically related to being a STEM graduate student, right? These are behaviors that one needs to engage in so that, it's on the slide before, that one needs to engage in order to be ready. So identifying my values, identifying my interests, identifying what I find rewarding, these are all common behaviors, right? But some of the questions might need to be tweaked. And if that is the case, then I would go through a process of conducting cognitive interviews, focus groups, expert review again.
I will say that for some of the items that we adapted from prior studies, we did find that the wording of the items was confusing to STEM graduate students. And so, you know, so we watched for that, even though they had been, you know, tested for other populations, they didn't quite work for STEM graduate students.
Cynthia, do you want to choose one last question?
So here's, sorry. In terms of someone wanting to adapt this toolkit to assess the IDP impacts, can I know frequency of data collection needed? Pre-stage at the first PhD or second PhD, or post-stage after graduation? I'm not sure if I understand your question, Tania. Do you want to unmute yourself and say a little bit more about that?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So what I want to ask is that this survey is kind of, can I use the same survey to the first year PhD student and measure it? And again, I use same survey at the 5th year and kind of realize the impact, or it is one-time instrument I'm giving to the student to take it?
So I know Laura has to jump off soon. So Laura, can you give that a few seconds? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, unmute.
This is designed to be administered to people at any stage of their graduate studies. I'm sorry, I have to run. I have to go teach. I don't know if that answered your question.
It's okay.
Okay. One thing that we had been thinking about at ACS is doing for a cohort yearly, or probably at the most frequency 6 months duration, because of the programming that is offered.
And I will say that when the toolkit with all the questions, you know, the scales and everything else becomes available, sure we'll be holding webinars and such. And yeah, we'll be including some guidance about appropriate ways to use the toolkit. Because I think there'll be a lot of questions about that. See that we're at the top of the hour, so thank you so much to Amy and Katie and the committee for hosting us here today.
Thank you so much. A warm round of virtual applause for our speakers, Laura, Cynthia, and Corey. Thanks for that fascinating and informative presentation. Just a reminder, like I dropped a link to the exit survey. I will be working on getting access to it. Thanks for your patience with the new GCC website and Google Drive technologies. Y'all will also receive a link to visit this recording when it's posted on the grad school's website. Stay tuned too for more announcements of our professional development's upcoming programming. For example, on March 31st, we'll have an opportunity to explore more about the evaluation process with a half-day interactive workshop. So building on today's theme of assessment and evaluation, you'll learn too with our guest speaker, Andrew Hartman, how to create a variety of evaluation programs for your university and trainees. Stay tuned through the GCC's communication channels to learn more about this. Again, it was great to see you all, and stay safe, take care, and hope to see you at future GCC events.